This is the July 4 weekend, the greatest American holiday of all time. What kid doesn't look forward to the 4-day weekend? All the parades, all the hot dogs, all the festivities.
The fireworks.
And the fireworks, and the fireworks. And, of course, we have with us in the studio, we have Darren Moore, who drove in from Groseal, and we're thinking about titling these segments More to the Point.
Well, hey, I'm really glad to be in the studio with you here, Jay, and to talk about the books of the Revolutionary era is something that always gives me a great deal of excitement. I'm a bit of a Revolutionary buff myself.
Now, let's think about July 4. When I grew up, I always was told to revere everything about America, America's founding, and we heard the story about George Washington and the cherry tree. No matter, we don't even know if the cherry tree story is true, but the undercurrent or the foundation of that whole principle is that from the earliest age, all of us learned that he is more or less the patron saint of this country. And even if he did something wrong, well, we don't talk about it very much or shouldn't talk about it much. But this is the old mantra everybody talks about. We should understand the real meaning of July 4. And the real meaning, as I study more about it, and as I get more involved in politics, is that there is a real consequence to being involved in protecting and defending the Constitution, protecting and defending what America is. And July 4, when those guys signed the Declaration of Independence, they were in effect signing a death warrant for themselves. And I have to admit, as we were preparing for this segment, I can't remember any particularly great books that I have read about the Revolutionary era. But we know there are two great books out there that have been published recently by David McCullough. So, Darren, get us up to speed on what we need to know. John Adams is about John Adams. 1776 is about the war.
He ends that book at the end of 1776 when Washington is crossing the Delaware to kill the Hessians and the British troops as they sleep on Christmas morning.
So is he setting the world up for a sequel?
That would be really wonderful. Yeah. David McCullough has such a sparkling prose as he writes. But it's so important that we realize about McCullough in particular that McCullough tells stories about history. Mm-hmm. It's an important distinction to make between his stories and a real historian like a Joseph Ellis or a Paul Johnson who write the hard history. Mm-hmm. And so the reason why McCullough's books are so important is because people remember stories better. Mm-hmm. And so
now, when we make the distinction, this is a big distinction that's made by one of my favorite authors of all time, Hilaire Belloc. All the historians and intellectuals I know, they're halfway scornful of Belloc. He's not a historian. And I say, oh my God, did you read his stuff? He's a great writer, tells great stories, a wonderful narrative. What is it that makes McCullough not a historian? Is it that he doesn't have the dates exactly right, or he doesn't have the documents in order?
I would say that McCullough is wonderfully historically accurate. And to strip him of the historian name, title, moniker may be the wrong thing to do. Yeah. The way that McCullough tells these stories, it's made for the movie mind of postmodern man.
Yeah, excellent commentary on a historian. Russell said exactly the same thing. He said that too many historians are fixated on dates, and it was just damn boring, whereas the story brings it alive.
Absolutely. We should not look at history or science or learning at all as simply an assembling of irrelevant and perhaps unimportant facts, but rather we need to stitch together. And of course, Russell was a big fan of Christopher Dawson, who invented the term meta-history, the whole concept of how ideas really shaped and pushed us through. And so, when you talk about Russell, we've talked about the idea of Russell's great book, The Roots of American Order, in which he really explains that the American experiment was really an extension of Western civilization and this long climb from man's climb from the swamp to the stars.
Yeah. So, okay, tell us, the two McCullough books are books that I have not read, but I can tell you for the last 10 years, the John Adams book came out 10 years ago, right?
John Adams came out in 2001, 1776, and 2005.
It seems every time I start talking about the Revolutionary with people who are halfway literate, they always say make reference to McCullough's book. Must reading for anybody who really, and easy reading. That's the important thing. My sister read it, and she's a good reader, reads excellent stuff, and she was raving about this right after it came out. Does it appear that these are going to be two timeless books that in 50, 80, 100 years, everybody is going to be expected to read that in college? Or we would hope, but
I hope so.
In a different
era.
And
HBO got it right too when they did the documentary.
I love that documentary. It was great.
As I read these books, it's funny because I'm this month I am going through these revolutionary books. We're having a revolutionary era summer with with this boy that I'm tutoring. Jack. Hi, Jack. And it's funny because I picked up 1776 again. And I'm like, boy, I really love this book. And it's amazing to me. The more I read, Jay, the more I realize how little I really know and how much I have forgotten about these books. So
you are absolutely right. So tell us about that book and 1776.
Okay, well, starting off with John Adams. John Adams, first of all, I should point out, is not only probably my favorite founder, but also, interestingly enough, our favorite author, Russell Kirk's favorite. Because Russell saw in John Adams this true conservative role model. One must understand just really how unique it was throughout the entire arc of history that there were this learned of men that had learned this great classical tradition, but also had a great deal of practical experience themselves, that on a found continent, it's almost like they found a new planet that they can move their society to here in America on this found continent. You have these great scholastic minds, great statesmanship. Now are given the opportunity to form a new country.
These folks knew Latin, they knew Greek, they had the traditional classical education.
Not only knew Latin and Greek, but they would, as Dr. Brad Berzer pointed out, my last trip to Piety Hill, that these founders typically would be able to take Virgil's Aeneid, translate it into Greek, then back into Latin, and then back into English at the age of 14, Jay.
Amazing.
So you think about how far the classical education has really fallen, particularly since Dewey and the educationists got a hold of it in the 20th century. It's very important then that we go back to these founding principles, these first principles, these enduring eternal verities that these men knew right into their hearts. You were talking about the stories of our founders, and it's interesting to point out that the founders' stories that they were taught in their childhood were the stories of the Athenians, of the Romans, particularly Cicero, Cato, Washington, could be called the American Cincinnatus for these reasons. The Federalist Papers were signed by Publius. And so the American founders, their stories were the stories that preceded them, whereas the reason we don't learn the stories about Cicero and Cincinnatus and all these great minds is because in many ways our education has been the stories about Washington and Adams and Hamilton. And so a lot of folks focus on how badly the slaves were treated and how the constitutional founding years really ignored the whole concept. They kind of kicked the can down the road, but a lot of folks don't realize just how bad other minorities were treated during the Revolutionary era as well. There's only one Catholic that signed the Declaration of Independence, and Michigan's own Brad Berzer, who holds the Russell Kirk Chair at Hillsdale College, wrote this unbelievably wonderful little book about James Carroll, the only Catholic signer of the Constitution, who really did so much for the American founding, even though he knew that Catholics were in no way going to be able to reach the level of office.
Good point there. There is a documentary out there about George Washington being a Mason, and the conflict and the difficulties and persecution that Catholics actually faced in those times.
And you're absolutely right. And one of the things that McCullough's 1776 book does is really shows the divine hand of providence seems to constantly interfere at a moment where things look most tragic, where everything's going to fall apart, and somehow a fog comes over the Hudson, or the right thing arrives at the right time with Knox and his guns, and all of these miracles seem to happen. And in fact, one book I'd like to recommend is The Miracle of Philadelphia, which talks about how, despite all of these incredible complications, this great compromise was forged, and a nation was able to come to life. And what has been called the 5,000-year leap took place.
Absolutely. That is a great book. Linda Hughes and Thayrone, who own the station, they recommend that continually. And I believe they have a whole stack of the 5,000-year leap that they're going to be distributing to people at the Wham Freedom Fest later today at Whitmore Lake. So tell us about that book, 1776.
Okay, well, 1776 is obviously a very interesting year because it wasn't until the middle of that year that they actually sought independence. So there was this whole buildup that McCullough does in the book about how most of our founders, frankly, were against independence. There were some that were really pushing for it, but the truth of the matter is, and particularly Franklin, although Franklin's influence, he seemed to really have put his oomph behind the movement for independence at that last critical moment. The grandfather of our nation, as Franklin has been called, was really one of the last guys to the show. And so when one really considers just how the reason that we rebelled, and it's so often overlooked, the reason we wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence was not because we wanted our independence so much as that we were reclaiming what were considered to be the sacred rights of Englishmen. We were an English colony. And so most folks remember that preamble of the Declaration of Independence, but they forgot the dozen plus reasons that begin with "he hath" when they're talking about King George.
Oh, yeah.
How he's eaten out our reserve, and he's stationed his troops in our, and all of the complaints that they had about George. They really just wanted to have the sacred rights of Englishmen.
Of English, yeah. They wanted to return us back to what we should have been, and that the king was screwing it all up, mainly with all those awful taxes, which are a fraction of what we're paying today.
We should never forget that the Revolutionary American War started as a tax revolt.
Yep. So Tea Party members, remember that. So today, by the way...
But it's also very important to point out that our founders felt, and conservatives, Russell makes this point regularly, that conservatives don't revolt because our founders did that for us. We have a system of government that allows us to settle our political problems peaceably. And so the conservative doesn't revolt, he conserves, he preserves, and he goes back to these things and recovers and refreshes and renews. And so it's very important to point out that, as Russell Kirk once said about the Declaration of Independence, as we're wrapping up here today, Jay, is that when that thing was written, although Lincoln said it was a rebuke for all of time to the reappearing faces of tyranny, that the Declaration of Independence was written in a way that could make it mean all things to all people. And so when we won our independence, immediately what happened is we had the Federalists and Republicans duking out over what was the proper role of government.
And they duke it out to this day.
Yes,
Darren, it has been great talking about all this, especially since the title of the show is The American Dream. This is really where it all started. Thanks for being with us. This has been a great show, and I look forward to talking about great books and great ideas in the future. Thanks, Darren. You're listening to The American Dream with Jay McNally on Wham 1600, and you all be sure that you are at the Wham Freedom Fest up in Whitmore Lake later today. Thanks a lot.